I want to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to, I brought along something to, I think, engage us in conversation. And what I want to begin is to actually ask you to look with me at something I wrote in 2006, because the origins of today's talk on differentiated assessment, which you see in my latest book, which has just come out in January, really comes from some significant concerns I had in and during a time when I was working in New York in the Lower East Side and in the dark as a researcher. I actually come to this work because in many ways I've been concerned about how schools are failing our students. So I'd like to sort of walk you into at least a couple of paragraphs of the environment that I came into. This is important because this is probably significant, and this was happening in January and February of 2006, still happens today. Beginning this week, New York City's fourth graders will take the state standardized test in reading and writing. Many people are looking forward to a repeat of last year when the city celebrated a nearly 10% increase in fourth grade reading scores. But not everyone is sharing in anticipation. Luis Castro, a 12-year-old from the Dominican Republic, is worried that he will not pass the test and thus be forced to repeat the fourth grade again. Like so many overage immigrant students at the school he attends in the Lower East Side, Luis is as tall as most 7th graders, has an incipient mustache, and is tired of being teased. Worst, he's afraid of disappointing his parents, who, like so many other immigrants, have pinned their hopes on their children. New York City schools base their decision on whether to promote students entirely on the results from state achievement tests. But these tests, which are written for native English speakers, discriminate against those who are still learning that language. Luis is a perfect case in point. His schoolwork shows that he made a significant progress since September, and he has met state standards in the work he's completed. But Luis takes state tests. He is unable to quickly comprehend what he reads in English, and that hurts his performance. Even by conservative estimates, immigrant children like Luis account for close to half the student population in the public schools across New York State. Doing well isn't simply a matter of knowing English. Standardized tests measure children's knowledge of cognitive academic language, or the language of a highly literate population. Students in the middle class areas like the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, Park Slope, and Riverdale are well versed in this language. But students in Washington Heights, Corona, East Brooklyn, and other low-income immigrant communities do not read, write, or speak this language fluently. In most cases, neither their parents nor other adults they come in contact with speak this language to them, and yet they are required to learn it to pass state tests and be promoted. Their test scores reflect the fact that they often must literally translate as they work, either from their native language to English or from the version of English they speak in their minority community to cognitive academic English. The solution to this problem, already used by many schools and districts in other parts of the country, is to use a student's body of work or a portfolio as an additional means, I point out, of assessment. When standardized tests alone reveal only the language difference of students, a growing body of research shows that a combination of formal tests and informal assessments can indicate their progress. Portfolios in particular capture both the process and products of a student's learning and reflect their multiple languages, multiple intelligences, and multiple abilities. And in many ways, in writing this, this pretty much summarizes what I'd like to share with you. I go on to point out the number of states and the controversies in research around policy and assessment. But I set the stage because I'd like to introduce you to Luis, several years later, who was really Fernando in grade 9. And when Luis was part of our research project, I was very excited to have a federal language assistance program project. It's called a FLAP grant, and I was pleased to be awarded that grant to design comprehensive assessment for children who are Spanish natives and English natives, Chinese natives and English natives. So we developed what were standardized, according to state standards, portfolios that were dual language, based on what existed from the state test to serve as an alternate form of looking at the capabilities of these kids. So here he is. And what I'm going to suggest to you is Luis came to the United States 1 year before that. That means that in 4th grade he arrived. And I'm going to suggest to you what he's created here. I think it's important to take a look at his work. He, in essence, has worked very diligently to try to tell us more about who he is. In terms of his table of contents in his area, he has brought what I think is important is an all about me section to talk about his dual languagism, the fact that he is going to show competencies in humanities, in science, in math, and in the other areas of his school day. Notice he's got both his English day and knowledge of his Spanish community. And I'm just going to flip through this because he's got an academic portfolio that shows things like, my chart shows how many miles they traveled, showing specifics related to linear quadratics that he had done. His explanation of the product, I do have it both orally and in writing. Now, clearly, it's just one hint, there's a lot more, that in this case, Luis or Fernando, if asked to explain his capability of linear quadratics, is able to tell you this in his portfolio, but is not able to show you this because he really can't read the question in the test at this point, given what is the challenge of cognitive academic English as a student in literature. So why bother to bring this question up? Well, I want to come back to this because as an individual, I don't know that everybody knows, but I was a special education teacher outside of, and I really came to research in my early 30s after almost 14 years being in classrooms with kids with disabilities and kids with language acquisition issues. And I worked for a long period of time both in the Boston Public Schools and then on to the American Community Schools of Athens, where I was the person responsible for giving the tests. And I kept collecting data on intelligence tests. I would give the WISPAR, which was how you decide whether a child has the IQ, and that was the determinant if the child belonged in special education. And then I had come up with actually a Tony test and other tests which were for non-native speakers, trying to better understand performance-based tests to see if I could gather information, because I was giving this test, believe me, knowing that these kids didn't know the language of the test, but we were making decisions at an American school serving the whole Mediterranean with many American military who had, you know, the dad might have been an English speaker, but the mom, a non-native English speaker, was really raising the kids without much English, and so the challenge was huge. What I'd like to suggest is this begins by thinking about issues of judgment. And what I'd like to point out is, so where did I start? I came back to the United States after years as a practitioner where I saw that the decision-making was often a comprehensive system, not a single measure. That people from Australia who had been trained, Canada who's been trained, British trained psychologists that were part of the teams that I worked with overseas said to me, you really got to be thinking about this if you're going to really be thinking about this diverse population who speak many languages, and the tests aren't normed on those groups. So I came to back to the United States after quite a long time and tried to get a job in the Cambridge Public Schools as a special educator school psychologist. They wouldn't hire me because they said, oh my goodness, you have 15 years of experience, but that's in an international school. We don't count those places. You got to start over. We'll put you on a pay scale for 5 years. And so I, to this day, say thank you that they did that, but I was shocked that my work overseas did not count, even though it was an American school. At this particular time in Cambridge Public Schools, they didn't think that my work was going to, or my work and practice could serve the Cambridge Public Schools. So I ended up doing what what am I going to do? I'm living here now. I ended up getting a position at Lesley College to actually try to teach teachers to work on issues of assessment. And at Lesley, they said, you can't stay here unless you get a doctorate. So somehow I said, oh God, where am I going to go? If I have to keep my job, I have to go across the street to Harvard to get a doctorate because I can work during the daytime and do my research. It's kind of silly, but that is really what brought me to research. And I had only one question in mind. And that question was really about, and you're going to see this, developing an assessment system for diverse language and literacy needs, because I had seen that there was no clear research-driven assessment to help us try to differentiate between a language acquisition issue and a learning disability. So we had population after population where language acquisition, are you learning English? Because the issues kids have, especially when they're young, look the same. The student work looks the same, the things we see, and it's very difficult. So I want to point out that the work started with what was a review of the literature, the assessment of young linguistic minority kids, which is here, my comprehensive, my qualifying paper. And in some ways I started by taking a body of literature, reviewing the research around early childhood, around assessment and linguistic minority kids. And I had to bring that together, focused on studies really over a 10-year period. And it's sort of, you know, they taught me, this is what they taught me to do, to basically take, if I was going to study language acquisition and learning disabilities, I had to review the literature on the assessment of young, not just any, linguistic minority children from I did it from 1987 to 1997 at the time. My hope was, because I really wanted to study young children before grade 3, when the decision about whether they'd be in special ed or whether they'd get into a program that would support their English, that was the defining time. By grade 3 and on, if they were in special education, you're going to see an interesting series of events. So this is, in a sense, the first piece that brings us to differentiated assessment. Why bother? I asked some serious research questions during the 90s. What does a review of the research suggest about how to best assess and teach language and literacy skills of linguistic minority kids? I asked then, well, if we're going to try to look at what research suggests, then what do experienced teachers who informally assess their language and learning skills in grades K to 3 do? And notice, I pulled a subset, a very significant subset of teachers who were those who were responsible, and I called it whose judgment counts. Those are the judgments that often count for whether a child ends up being in special education or not. It's the kindergarten through grade 3 teachers who begin to say, I think there's a learning problem, or I think there's a language problem, or I know how to handle it, or I don't know how to handle it. And so what I did was survey 90 teachers across the Cambridge Public Schools literacy teams with a checklist. And then he went on to design a questionnaire to all 90 of the teachers who taught K to 3 kids to basically look at this question. I then wanted to know, well, how do these teachers link their assessment of language and learning with instruction? So I selected 6 Cambridge Public School teachers from these questionnaires to do what was called a vignette interview. That is a think aloud protocol, like what would you do in this scene? And I'm going to show you. I spent an hour interviewing those teachers related to their interview thereafter about what they say they do and what they do in practice. And then I spent 3 weeks supported by funding for advanced doctoral work, sitting in their classrooms drawing diagrams of what happened every day to look at the kind of informal and formal assessments that took place. A series of case studies of 6 teachers, which I present later as my my dissertation, and eventually became this book, Assessing Bilingual Children, K-12. So what I'd like to suggest is this is what I did, guided by a number of different wonderful people who helped advise me. This is a vignette interview. And in this vignette, I went and I sat down with teachers and I said, okay, a student arrives in your setting with difficulties in language and literacy. You're told the child comes from a background you know nothing about. You've been told by the administrators that the student has a learning disability, according to the parents. What's the first thing you do to understand how the student learns? How do you assess the student's language skills, and how do you assess the student's literacy skills? So you see my research questions, and you see I put it right into this vignette or this think aloud. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think they said for the first question? What's the first thing you do to understand how a student learns? Now, these are little kids walking into a kindergarten. We don't know who they are. The teachers, these were Cambridge Public School early childhood teachers. What do you think they said?
What phrase are going to tell you to take a test?
Some said that I have been told I have to give the kid a test.
I would say probably observe the student, how the student interacts with materials or contents, or when they're given an activity, how does the student
Other
respond?
teachers said that watch what the child does. What do you think other teachers said?
Have a conversation with the student.
Try to talk to the child. See, you know, how much English you hear. Do they speak another language to other kids? What else do you think they might have said? Well, a few said, ask the parents, because it says the parents that the child has a learning disability. So go ask the parents, what's the documents you have, or where did you go, or how come you say this? And similarly, what I did was gather information from this large group of teachers about assessing what do you do to understand the language. They would say things like have a conversation, talk to the parents, talk to the grandparents, how do you assess literacy, watch them read, give them a book, try their native language, try another language. And in a complicated sense, I was shocked to see that these teachers had a wealth of strategies in their hands. Like they could just sit there and tell me I could do this, I could do that. And no one had ever really listened to these teachers to figure out what were strategies that, and I chose best practice teachers, teachers who had over 20 years experience in the Cambridge Public Schools, who had pretty much been brought forward as teachers who helped not take kids or misplace kids. And so those were the select group of teachers I looked at, and this was my first piece of data that I collected from these teachers. So in summary, what I did was I piloted this work with 90 teachers. I then looked at 61 teachers also who were teaching inclusion classes. Those were bringing in kids with disabilities and typical kids. My first set of case studies were with K to 3, 13 teachers, 6 experienced teachers, and my findings really brought out some specific themes. They talked a lot, these teachers, about observing kids and interviewing groups of people involved around that child's lifestyle. They talked about trying to see how the child responds to the curriculum they teach before judging whether the child knows or doesn't know. So what I teach, I try to look at what the child does while they teach. And they talked about trying to keep track of work samples. That is, keeping track of what a child did one week and look at if there's some change after they've been in the classroom, the next week, and the next week, and the next week, so that keeping the work sample seemed a significant piece. I went on to carry this research forward in the Boston Public Schools, then looking at a similar pattern, but looking up through grade 4, because in Boston Public Schools, grades 3 and grade 4 take referrals seriously for special education when it's a non-native English speaker, and so the timing for when to look at that group. And as you can see, sort of the data shows, I think that, you know, I really looked at a lot of teachers and talked to a lot of people. And my first piece on the Cambridge Public Schools was my dissertation. I gave it an interesting title, and you'll see why. It was called Whose Judgment Counts? Case Studies of Primary Teachers' Classroom Assessment of Linguistic Minority Kids. And the teachers basically said to me that I needed to stop talking to them as a researcher and start talking to them about their judgment and their own intelligence, because they had years of experience and they weren't sure that research had a good idea about what to do for children, and especially minority kids, especially when it came to assessment. In fact, quite a number of teachers pointed out that, you know, and I didn't know what theoretical frameworks were at that point, but they said, well, if you really want to think about this question that you've got language acquisition and learning disabilities, it's a bigger question. and the teachers told me this, it's really about assessing and teaching all kids, including the bilingual and special needs kids. Because frankly, I can't only do one thing, but I do a lot of things. In fact, I think about that child. Eventually, I realized this was, my literature search taught me that this is a sociocultural theoretical framework. But the child sits in a world of linguistic factors, their first language, their second language, the number of languages they've been exposed to, cultural factors, like they're in Cambridge, how long have they been in Cambridge? Do they want to be in Cambridge? Do their parents want to be in Cambridge? Social factors, boy, girl, new to the school, how long, friends, and political factors. There are so many kids who are I don't know what you want to call it, but immigrants whose parents weren't so excited about letting people know they're in the schools. They were obviously immigrants of non-declared, however you want to put it, so the parents were often nervous and moved their kids from school to school, given the fact that they often lived in different places over time. So we had a transient factor. So we had, or I was in fact brought to a theoretical framework that basically said, look, there are a social and cultural series, or a theoretical framework needs to be looked at, that basically opens up the question to much more than a single way of best testing and teaching kids who speak at least more than one language and may come from more than one culture. I was shocked because what I was taught to do by my then mentor, Courtney Kasdan, was this thing called narrative interviewing, and I kind of didn't know what it was as a practitioner. And what she said is, you basically interview students and you interview the teachers. The same. So if you're going to start studying or looking at kids' work samples, you've got to go talk to those teachers and go test it out with somebody who's a really excellent person to see what happens when you ask them, why should I study classroom assessment? Well, this is probably the first teacher. This was when I was piloting my research study, and she basically put me in my place as a researcher coming from Harvard, and she said, when it comes to assessing children with language and learning needs, it's the school psychologists, their expertise in assessment, that is in giving tests, is seen as the judgment that counts. So when it's whose judgment counts, it's them, not me. Why are you wasting your time talking to me? I have no authority. But if you really want to learn about assessing children, she didn't say minority children, I was talking about it. Ask classroom teachers who have years of strategies to use. After about 3 weeks in my classroom, I can tell what a child needs and how to best teach him or her, even if they speak little English. So because of this narrative interview, I said, I think I need to go, instead of taking all my quantitative questionnaires, go live in those classrooms and follow people like her, because she's giving me the clue that something happens in those classrooms if I watch kids for 3 weeks that I might miss. I took that as a next step, and in looking at the literature, I was shocked to see that there was a confusion of terms. What is assessment and what is evaluation? Clearly, a series of researchers, and I've been playing with this, really were quite confused, because assessing really means to sit beside the learner. And sitting beside the learner, in fact, means coming right over and literally being on equal terms. Literally eye to eye, so that the learner feels that they can talk to me and I can talk to them. So the word assessment, which comes from the Latin assediere, and in French asseyez-vous, means sit beside. And the term assessment really is about sitting beside learners, so that if we want to more accurately assess children, that is, gather collections of information, we need to, in some ways, get information from those who sit beside. Now, who sits beside children?
Other children.
Other children. Who else? Teachers. Who else? Parents. Who else? Siblings. Grandparents. In essence, a key piece here is thinking about all the information that's stocked among key people who know that child. And at least if you want to figure out how to best meet the needs of that child, you need to get some information parallel to whatever they show up on test scores, because this test scores norm and rank them according to how they fit in groups. And indeed, if we are going to best to teach all children, we have to think about who the child is as well as what they are in their test scores. We need more information than just a test to make a serious decision. In fact, and a lot of you have seen this, we have a long history of taking intelligence tests and misusing them with immigrant populations. In many ways, this is the big head of education in 1922. Lewis Terman started intelligence tests. This is a biography about him, but here's the field of education, and we used intelligence tests to basically try to do a better job about immigrant students based on what we knew. But I guess I'm asking, seeing that intelligence test started to decide whether kids were mentally retarded or not. But if any of you know the literature, we had a huge abundance of Spanish-speaking kids, Puerto Rican kids, and the laws that came out in the 50s and the 60s showed that there was a high percentage of Spanish speakers who were placed in classes for the mentally retarded based on English-only intelligence tests. And only through a series of, and it's Lau versus Nicholas, if you want the test cases on that, the significant policy came out after parents, a whole generation of parents began to sue, finding that all those kids were in classes for the mentally retarded. I guess what I'm going to suggest, if we're still at it in schools using often decision-making with IQ tests, and we still have a lot of kids who are being given IQ tests to determine whether they belong in special education when they don't speak English. Which, if it were up to me, it should be a warning on the outside of the IQ package, sort of like a cigarette pack that says, warning, this may be hazardous to your health. It's hazardous to the education of a child if an IQ test alone, in English, determines their future. And in fact, that's what the research points out, is we look at, myself and a group of people, the overrepresentation of minorities in special education. Alba Ambert, Luis Balca, more recently, Beth Perry, have really looked at the fact that in special education, once a referral by classroom teachers, we're talking about teachers often before grade 3, happens, the likelihood of testing is high. And once a child is tested, the force for special education placement is in motion. In fact, the referral to assessment to placement rate for a minority student is 75 to 90%. It means once a minority student is referred, let's just forget whether they've given the test or not, it means the same child is placed in special education around 85% of the time. Anybody want to wager a guess what the, and some of you know, but what it is for non-minority students? Percentage? 33%. So, the other piece is once a child is placed in special education, despite a mistake in assessment, it takes on average 6 years to exit. So that means a child who has been given a mistaken form of assessment is placed in special education and stays there because there's a 3-year annual review, and then there isn't another one for 3 years, so there isn't necessarily another look at why they're there and whether it was a language problem or a learning disability. So that my first think aloud question is an important one. I realized later when I looked at what was a basic problem. The research is clear. Timing influences bilingual kids trying to take tests because they think in one language and they think in another language, and it takes more time. Their cognitive flexibility is an asset, but their timed performance is always a problem. The sequential formats are extremely invalid for use with minority kids. How many of us speak another language? Anybody in here? Okay, so where's the answer? If you tell a story, where is the main idea? Is it at the beginning of a paragraph or the end of a paragraph in English? I mean, we teach sort of out of the paragraph. It's a main idea and how many points, right? 4 points, 5 points. However, if you think of text in another language, where is the main idea? It's the end. So that the sequential format for items that are given for kids in testing, again, backwards and upside down for these kids. And so when we evaluate native language proficiency, that really needs to happen to see if a child has acquired sufficient English before you make a decision around learning potential. So really the research now is clear. In fact, I met with Charlene Rivera and Marco Sal-Peterson that a decision making should include a collection of formal and informal assessments in first language and second language. That's why we had the federal grant to try and do bilingual portfolios, because the decision making really shouldn't be just on their state tests alone. And there is legislation on that behalf. Now, whether it's enacted, it's not completely true, because we don't have bilingual school psychologists. We don't have bilingual testing people. We don't have bilingual teachers. We don't have bilingual teaching, any at all. And so children who come without a language of the native language, actually, are a huge problem. So what I did, to be quite honest, is I attempted to really look at classroom assessment, what happens with teachers, what happens with kids. And I came to realize that observing kids, assessing kids, and documenting their work in a classroom, that means collecting samples of their work, was a critical piece of this work, if they came from another culture. And in many ways, that meant keeping track of learning samples and collecting student work over time. That's why I've become a portfolio person, because there's the collection, there's the evidence. Yes, they did it, or yes, they were taught it before you decide about these kids. I could go on for a significant amount of time, and any who are interested. This is really chronicled in here and chronicled in 2 books. This, myself and a group of researchers put together Teaching Immigrant and Second Language Students Strategies for Success. My colleague Michael Sadowski and a group of people who were in my doctoral cohort. Eventually it's Don Friedman, myself, and actually I could pass this one around. Basically with the 1 in 5 population in New York, and we were all faculty in New York, Harvard Ed Letter actually let us do a short piece to talk about how to better serve students. And this was something that came out in 2006, right after, you know, someone said, okay, you write an article in the New York Times, get something out so we can come up with an answer. So that was what our group put together. And if you don't mind, Joan, passing it around, that would be great. Okay. In research, qualitative studies basically helped me design what was, in my data analysis I organized, was amazing in that using a theoretical framework of social culture, these teachers began to show me that, look, I don't just assess the kid, I think and plan. And this is where I took massive amounts of data, and they kept saying, I need to find out more about that kid's culture. Should they look at me? Should they not look at me? I need to plan an environment that allows for kids, other kids who are buddy systems that speak the language, that could coach the kid, bringing in a teaching assistant, that was a key piece. Because the kid needs help in using the language. This has got to happen in my classroom so I'm ready to receive kids who are non-native speakers. So even, you know, anything we did that would help, it meant that all teachers would have this mindset before they begin to see what the students' strengths are and watching how they interact. This was a sociocultural framework, in fact, of an assessment process that all of the 90 and 60, 150 teachers spoke about. And analyzing my data, if anybody's interested, I'll tell you about how I had it all in folders, how I put it into place, how we did member checking, all of the key pieces in this process. These teachers basically said there were 3 key patterns. Social interaction. Can the kids carry it out? Do they get along with the other kids? And I have to watch that when I talk to them by themselves, when they're working with other kids in pairs, and when they're in the whole group. It's different in different places. The kid that's going to succeed who doesn't speak English can handle all 3 of those. Then I need to figure out, well, is there a serious cultural issue in the way? Like if, and I've got so many examples of kids who come from Arabic countries, from Ethiopian countries. One of the most amazing stories is of a parent, a teacher who found one of her Ethiopian students sitting in the cafeteria taking 35 cups of ketchup from the lunch ladies and putting it on a tray and putting it on the food in order, and using the, using hands to eat, Kid was reported, put in trouble. Mainly why? Because in Ethiopia you eat with your fingers and the stuff was so bland the kid couldn't eat the stuff. And he was catching, but this child was incredibly punished for what was his new American behavior. So the number of cases where we don't know the culture and we're making judgments, again back to whose judgment counts, I think are significant. These are, in many ways, the language and literacy questions, and teachers spoke directly about when they observed. So, they understood the cultures, they understood a language learning environment, they probed for strengths. That means they assume the kid has something going and I don't speak English, I've got to find it. So they're watching and questioning and interviewing, but the big piece was, I'm keeping track of the student's work. And that meant that I can create a mental file on that kid that's not just what I remember, but it's also what I've done and what we've done in the classroom. So is progress being made? Is the testing the most valid, or is what I'm teaching the most valid? I'm going to suggest that as a researcher, I was stunned by the depth of knowledge of these teachers. And it led me to realize that they had a comprehensive assessment system that involved kid watching, keeping track, and documenting, collecting evidence of those kids. How simply put and how beautifully organized by a group of teachers as a researcher, yet how little of that is being used in the field, especially among our own childhood teachers. It led me to basically say that if we're going to think about classroom assessment, we need to be thinking about meeting high standards. We're saying, how are we, teacher and learner, doing? And how can we, teacher and learner, do better? No one ever said it's a we. It's always the kid isn't right. But neither we're not right in how we judge that child. Some of my graduate students collected what I think is a very interesting new take. These were a number of students who I worked with in 2003 and 4 at Harvard, who basically said, look, this really applies to special ed big time. Remember I said I didn't know, I was focused on the linguistic minority kids, that's where the funding came from, but basically what they said is, look, if you collect information from a child, if you start an intervention, this is now called RTI, by the way, but this was then figured out as, it's now the buzzword, but if you start to do something with a kid and you've given assessments in their native language, you should see how well they're competent in the curriculum as well as how they perform on the test. Did they know, were they ever taught that material? Then, if you're keeping track of a portfolio and you're looking for the strengths, then observe the student, interview the family, the teachers, and the community members, and in essence, you'll get parent expectations, student strengths. These were people who were doing research in other areas, in high risk and resiliency. They basically said, look, that actually could feed into the IEP, the individual educational plan. So you'd have students' challenges, current status, goals, and a plan for achievement. So in many ways, I was given by my students as a researcher another set of ways of thinking about the research. So I want to, in about 5 more minutes, bring you to today's work. And this is something I shared recently at the Leslie Literacy Conference, because in many ways this book, Differentiated Assessment, How to Assess the Learning Potential of Every Child, is in essence a building block of a series of works I did around multiple intelligences portfolio with the Mass Department of Education. I was part of a research team that was implementing portfolios from 1995 to 2000. It was actually 95 to 2009. Well, it was actually 1999. And we were having MCAS plus portfolio. That really was the original policy. And in essence, a group of us had set up districts across Massachusetts. This body of work chronicles that work, and what was amazing is that the portfolios began to help us, especially with non-native English speakers, do a better job at assessing kids, especially young children. And all of the communities that started that research, despite the change of John Silber and banning all that work, still do it. So they're written up here. What I want to do is speak to this most current work, which is based on, as I said, the 2006 research work, where we actually started working. After I finished this work, I had an office near Ted Sizer, who was then teaching near me. And he said, you know, Evangeline, this is very great. You did all this work with up to K-8. But the real mess, the real collision course is high school. If you're going to do any significant research before I pass away, and he just passed away and I did it, and sort of, he pushed me to get to high school. So this research summarizes, and this book is dedicated to Ted Sizer, who basically said to me, you know, we can't talk about minority kids without talking to the ones who really arrive late and are really in a collision course with public schooling. So let me tell you briefly about what I have found in more recent research. And this is taken place from 2006 to 2009 in collaboration with Teachers College Columbia in a series of 9 middle schools in the Lower East Side, in the East Bronx, and in Chinatown. Quite an interesting piece came out of this was that we began moving away from a sociocultural framework to thinking about Howard Gardner's work. Well, multiple languages, multiple intelligences, maybe this is a different entry point to the work. And when you look at what Gardner said about how he defined intelligence, he basically said it's the ability to solve real-life problems, the ability to find and create problems, and the ability to offer a product or service that's valued in at least one culture. So basically, he asked us to think about child as linguist, child as artist, child as scientist, child as reflective learner, child as cooperative learner, child as mathematician. And I think it's fascinating to think about what it would be like to actually look at middle schools in New York and see what this looks like. So I want to share with you some of what kids created in thinking about this work, and I think it's an interesting piece, because if we look at their work, we're going to see a bunch of different things that probably surprise us in big ways. I want to show you, these are samples of our Spanish-speaking kids, part of the work samples that we collected. We used state standards from New York City in English and in Spanish. We looked at who the students were, how we could comprehensively track their reading and writing and speaking in September and January and May. We did that in terms of writing and grammar related to the New York State standards, as well as math, Spanish, arts, and sciences. What strikes you as you look at this is the quality of students' work in English and how well they can reflect, how well they can design projects, how well, in fact, they can do classroom work. What I think is striking is how well they can address an opinion with small amounts of English, how well they can reflect on their work. This is a student who says, and she's a 4th grader, she's been in the United States 1 year, when asked, which piece of work are you most proud of? What will you like best about this work? I'm proud of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory packet I completed. She read the book. She did all the literature work. You saw all the samples of it. I got through all of the book and the packet. So there she is, you know, taking her books, reading them all every day, sitting in her classroom and finishing it. I think an interesting point is the quality of her artwork, the quality of her non-language-based logical work in the sciences. And a review. I'm proud of designing a cereal box because I tried my best and the box looked colorful. I felt like I did a lot of work. I chose to put my cereal box in, but it didn't fit. So I tried it with my partners and we got it done. An indication of that child as a reflective learner, an indication of that child as a cooperative learner, of a mathematical thinking not relevant in any other ways. I could go on quite a bit, but I think what's quite impressive here is the way the child tells you about what they know, and if they can't use the language, will draw you a picture and explain it to you. So are we talking about cognitive academic language, and are we leaving out the thinking that's in process with some of these kids? I suggest we are. I'm going to suggest that the more we have, this is later on, Thinking Myself is a full autobiography of Thinking Myself as a reader. I think I'm a good reader because I love to read books about other people's lives. I also like to read books. I'm reading now about Abraham Lincoln and his life in the war. Is she getting an acquisition of American culture? Finally, is she being introduced to stuff she's going to be needed on tests? I'd be glad to share more about this, but what's incredible is samples of book reports, samples of how she designs the book reports, samples of what she's taught. Her oral samples are documented, we can hear them, and this is how we do it. We let the kids use a PowerPoint, they insert a picture, click, and they make them themselves starting in 4th grade. And this is all now chronicled, I think, very specifically. What I'm going to suggest is that this isn't necessarily just, and this is a Spanish-speaking sample. I want to show you a sample from These are samples done by older kids. As time went on, we found that 8th graders came up with incredible animations to express their work. They chronicled it. They came up with, this is a kids in really with no English at the middle school level, and how they began to acquire English and explain what they were about, how in many ways, where their name came from, who their family was. This was all information the teachers had no clue about. This kid lived with all these people. So when we wonder about why her science work might have been a little late, she pointed out that she had a reflection about it. How to make butter. She had come up with a social studies project that was all the ingredients and explained it. This is her design about a project. Now, this was hands-on, this was something she did, this was something she could write about. I have somewhere around, I could go on and on, but I can't tell you how many portfolios. I probably have about 400 portfolios from kids in the middle years and all of these teachers and all of these kids. They are stunning examples, I think, of the possibilities with kids. I think that and I want to point out, what did we do to make this happen? With our grant, we had a PowerPoint that went out to teachers and went out to kids across the schools. These were my 2 research assistants. They made this with no English, really, and used it in Spanish and used it in Chinese to explain to the parents what we're going to do. They realized that collecting student work, that is evidence of what is being taught and keeping track of it, was something that's going to happen every 2 weeks, so this is what we need to do. They explained how the process would work. They explained how they go from folders to digital and how they put it into the computer. They even came up with tracking systems so that how many kids in a class and kids kept track of who did what. So we needed all those work samples, and kids, older kids, helped make it happen. There is much more detail about this project. What I'd like to suggest is that the essence of what we've come to is really that differentiated assessment is about differentiated learning for all. That in many ways we need to adapt the curriculum, we need to adapt the instruction, and we need to adapt the assessment. That there is, in fact, fundamentally in this book and its case studies of the work, a need to think about what it is, what does it look like, teach teachers to look at teaching through film, and ask them to think about the questions. How are you going to assess learners? How do you use assessment to design your instruction? And what are you going to teach, and how are you going to teach? Boiling it down to basics. And this is a framework that, in fact, will allow us to differentiate both our assessment and instruction in one format. Done this a lot across the board. It's done it as trainings and worked through the National Academy. We worked with large numbers of teachers. You can see how we really help them think about co-teaching and planning. And here's the framework we came up with. It's about knowing your learners. It's about designing lessons with multiple entry points and posing open-ended questions. It's about pulling individuals and groups, and about explaining, modeling, and demonstrating. And so if you take on that you've got to know the student, that means the portfolio is a collection of information that helps you as a diagnostician. If you think about designing lessons with multiple entry points, it means the portfolio helps you look at the pieces of a lesson as well as the final test report. If you're going to think about helping kids from what you've learned from the portfolio, then sometimes you have to work with individuals and sometimes you have to work with small groups. And in essence, that means that a teacher is really explaining, modeling, demonstrating, and guiding, and letting the kids do more work in action as opposed to really carrying out that work in another way. I'm going to suggest that, there's quite a bit people who are taking the course have had a chance to read some of this book. I'm going to suggest that I'm very interested in your feedback and ideas. It does chronicle the work of these middle schools and high schools. It also comes with samples of student portfolio, a DVD that's complete that shows some of the samples of work we used, the lesson plans we used, and the designs and framework for it. It has PDFs so that it can be used by teachers in the field. They can print them out and translate them into their native language. What strikes me now is that this is a planning tool that we developed as researchers. It's a single lesson planning tool that says what some students will learn, and it helps teachers think about how to plan. It's one of the PDFs on here. You can sort of see it. And this has now been adopted by the middle school curriculum in the New York Public Schools as a result of some of our research. So all middle school teachers are now learning and using a consistent lesson plan format, so they begin to think about what all kids need, what kids who speak another language might need, and kids with disabilities need, and that they're beginning to differentiate their assessment. So I'm mindful of our time. I want to leave some time for questions, and I have so much more, but I hope this helps you see a bit of what has been moving from, your idea to a piece of research to a piece of continued research, moving from studying young kids to older kids, moving from what is work in practice and directly related to schools to work that eventually can inform policy. I want to suggest that a lot of this writing has been as a result of what has been of grave concern about the conditions for minority kids in American schools. And so I more than welcome you as researchers, policymakers, in taking seriously. The dearth of research on this is huge. The reason I ended up doing this is because I got funded to do my work because no one else would have done it. And myself and 9 people were funded, all of us still involved in this work, but the gap is that big. So if you're interested in minority students, if you're interested in differentiated assessment, if you're interested in portfolios, there's a huge need for people to carry on this work. So I'm glad I had a chance to share my story, and I'm open for questions.
Have you done with professional development in schools?
I have, but I should be doing more. I did a lot in New York. The National Academy for Teaching Excellence was a vehicle we had at Teachers College where we brought in principals, mostly worked with principals and school teams. And this differentiated book came out of that work. That's why you'll see it written in a much simpler format with discussion questions. And it's really compiling the professional development that I did with teachers in New York. But since coming to Boston University, I haven't, and I'd love to. I don't know how we do it, though. We're sort of like an arm of outreach work that came at Teachers College where we, could get credit to do it. But I'd love to be out in Boston, or I'd love to be out, working with schools too.
I think
That's a
that
great
would be
question.
wonderful. I think that would be great.
Other questions? And it can be about your research, how it might parallel it, or how you get through it.
One of the concerns that people have about systems, the whole student evaluation,
Yep.
is some people suggest that it devalues the importance of learning that good academic English.
Yep.
And that if we're encouraging children to go on to college more and more, that learning that good English is important. So how does that demonstrate itself in the portfolio system? What would you tell them? How do you tell people, no, we're still encouraging them to learn good English?
Yeah. I think that it's very important to be, let's see, yeah. In many ways, am not saying that we're not going to be using tests. I think we keep tests as one piece of variable. In no way have I've always said test plus, and I think I pretty much says that in my article. We're not, I'm not saying we take away the test. I think the test is where we're headed. But what I think is important is what decision making happens when and how long kids have been in the United States and what kind of opportunity to learn, so that the decision is based on an opportunity to learn. So that what we know about research around the acquisition of second language is that it takes 3 to 5 years to acquire cognitive academic English, not just conversational English.
Right.
So that if we think of a window of possibility of building a comprehensive system, we're not taking away, but we're adding on. In fact, what came, it's a great question, what these middle schools did is they had a full day in English and a full after-school clubs in Spanish or in Chinese, so the kids were maintaining their native language and building the English at the same time. All of these schools were full-service schools from 7 in the morning to 7 p.m. And so they were really acquiring native fluency in their native literacy language skills as well as English language simultaneously. So it wasn't like what we have as transitional bilingual, what they were talking about dual language instruction, and massive amounts of it before grade 12, especially for little kids. So that's the design they're using in New York, dual language.
Now,
I wonder in terms of the rate of dropout, whether or not you found that this would overwhelm students in test.
This is a great question, Joan, because what happened was they sent us to these schools because most of the kids were dropping out by 8th and 10th. These were the kids, really, when I started this work, I pretty much was with a bunch of thugs and everybody didn't know what to do with them. These kids love doing a portfolio, but for a different reason. That is, they can show off, part of what was strong is their knowledge of, they're interested in computers, they want to do media, they're interested in the, showing what they know. And so a lot of them did no work or little work in, we used Fannie Lou Freedom High School. We had probably 10 high schools in the Bronx. And those high schools, the kids came to do their portfolios more than they went to class, because they'll do the work to make it available to show a teacher, and if they'll give them the grade for it, they'll do it. It's sitting in the desk and getting nowhere that a lot of them said was a problem. So it was interesting because it allowed us to compact the curriculum. A lot of teachers brought small groups if they were willing to go back over and bring their work or work they did half done and put it into the portfolio. It was, in fact, an incentive. And a lot of them came during their lunch hours. I mean, really, if you could have seen who was in there with me, sometimes I wonder, but I was amazed. They do want to learn, and they definitely want to get out of school, and they don't necessarily want to drop out. They just can't do it in the traditional ways. No, they can't pass the test by 8th grade. They don't have enough English. So if they have a chance to use the test and they know they're failing, plus the portfolio, they'll put out on the portfolio. And it allows them to do it a little bit with both their languages. Other questions?
So you were talking about like the formal evaluation and like the test that we use and how that's meant for a specific norm of individuals.
Yeah.
What would it take to ensure that all groups are incorporated in the evaluative process. Because evaluation, like you said, is different than assessment,
Yeah.
but evaluation is what counts when it comes to
Yeah, and
going up
I
grades
think
and
that's
stuff like that.
You know, I actually have really thought a lot about that, Brenton, and that's been one of the challenges, is how do you build a system that brings all those things together. What I'm going to suggest is, I think we need a tiered system, an assessment for learning system. I don't know that I have it here. No, I don't know that I've kept it. But I think we need a system that has the test, performance assessments that may be state-based, and those are a collection of what are the evaluation systems, and the portfolio, and then criteria that are the same rubrics that are based on the state tests that help us with second language learners, with kids with disabilities, so we have a comprehensive system rather than multiple measures, basically. Because multiple measures means, if we have paper and pencil tests that for kids who have the cognitive academic language, we have sample, they've made it. If we have performance tests, they can show us some in writing and some orally, then we have an opportunity to keep them while they're acquiring English. And then if we have a portfolio that shows, yes, they've been taught the stuff they need for the test, then we know how valid or invalid the test is for this particular child to develop a good decision-making system. So it's an assessment for learning model that includes evaluation, 2 types, and assessments.